Hola, buenas noches. Gracias por venir al ciclo Heterocronías. Si se acuerdan todos de apagar el móvil ahora, antes de que comience a hablar Mary Ann Doane. Para los que hayan conseguido el libro Heterocronías, Mary Ann tiene traducido uno de los capítulos de su libro The Emergence of Cinematic Time, la emergencia del tiempo cinemático, en el Reader, que les recomiendo a todos que lean. Y además tenemos bastante ilusión de que esté aquí porque el resto del libro, el libro completo, será una de las traducciones que presente el Cendeac. Esperamos que en el 2009, con lo cual podrán un poco conocer más a fondo el pensamiento de Mary Ann. Ella es catedrática de cultura moderna y medios en la Universidad de Brown, en Estados Unidos. Y entre sus libros está La emergencia del tiempo cinemático, que estará pronto en español, y un libro sobre la figura de la femme fatale en el cine, que tenemos en la biblioteca del Cendeac para quien lo quiera consultar. Creo que es una persona que tiene ya una sobrada carrera hablando no solo sobre cine, sino relacionando el cine con cosas como el psicoanálisis, la televisión y un poco el contexto social más amplio que rodea a la práctica cinematográfica. Creo que será una charla sobradamente entretenida y divertida, y así que creo que lo mejor será que pasemos ya directamente a escucharla a ella. Muchas gracias.
Okay, is this working? First of all, I'd like to thank Miguel Hernandez Navarro for having invited me here. I'm very pleased to be participating in this very interesting series of talks. The topic of my talk tonight, this is brand new. You were the first to have ever heard it, and it is in progress. It is a bit drafty. But the topic has to do with a kind of long-standing argument about the spatialization of time in modernity and postmodernity. Hence the title, Has Time Become Space? And the kind of works that I deal with in the paper are quite varied, as you'll see, ranging from photography, as in Sugimoto's work, which you see here, digital photography, film, Taiwanese film, and an entirely different kind of form, which is usually thought not to exist at quite the same level or have the same status, and that is the movie trailer. And I've been very interested in movie trailers for a long time because I often find them much more interesting than the film that comes afterwards. And there's a kind of lure or fascination with the movie trailer, and I think it has very much to do with time and with an attempt at spatializing time. So the title again is Has Time Become Space? I don't intend to answer it, however. The photograph, I'm referring to this photograph by Hiroshi Sugimoto. The photograph rigorously centers its object. A shadowy dimness surrounds that center, drawing the gaze to the brilliance of the screen itself, which seems to collect and return all the luminance of the scene in a small interior frame that is a reiteration of the larger frame of the photograph. Nevertheless, the surrounding environment is legible, decipherable as a rather standard theatrical space, with curved and tiered rows of seats and an ornamental architecture encasing the screen, lending it a supplemental value. It is a cinema seemingly without a movie, simply holding a surplus of light shining forth from the place where that movie should be. The light is all intense presence without the proliferation of differences that would generate meaning. From the cinema screen and the photograph in its entirety are evacuated the movement and duration that we believe to be the special, most salient characteristics of film as a medium. But in reality, rather than the lack or loss of a movie, the spectator is witness to all of a movie, all at once. This 1978 photograph is entitled UA Playhouse, New York, and is part of a series called Theaters by Hiroshi Sugimoto, known for his technique of using an 8x10 large format camera and extremely long exposures. In the series, spanning 20 years, Sugimoto chose a number of old American movie palaces, ornately decorated, as well as more austere outdoor drive-in screens, and left the shutter of his still camera open for the entire length of the movie. And I'll show you the series here. This is the Ohio Theater, the UA Walker in New York, the Avalon Theater, and then a series of drive-in theaters. And I'm going to stop on this one again because I have a little more to say about it. According to Sugimoto, the series is a product of his own self-directed question. Suppose you shot a whole movie in a single frame. The answer being, you get a shining screen. What we are left with is an extreme condensation of time, its transformation into an overwhelming assault of radiance. The process seems to embody all the spectacle of cinema in a single instant. The frame, which is usually the condition of possibility of movement in film, becomes movement's totalizing container. A well-known shot of extremely long duration from Chai Ming Liang's Goodbye Dragon Inn of 2003 seems to work in multiple ways as a reverse shot of Sugimoto's theater photographs. From the point of view of the screen, we see a shot of the auditorium of the movie theater, empty save for the slow movements of a cleaning woman making her rounds. And this part of the shot takes about 3 minutes. And after she leaves the frame, the shot is held for almost another 2.5 minutes. The shot is introduced by an abrupt cut after the final shot of the film that has been projected. The lights come on, but the auditorium is already vacated, populated only by row after row of empty seats. I'm going to show you part of that scene. It's a long scene, so I won't show the entire thing. Okay, it will begin with the before the shot, before the cut. And you see the woman who is a kind of attendant or cleaning woman who comes into that space later on, looking through a doorway at the screen at the final shot of the film that's being shown within the theater. Okay, she will move up here and across here, meanwhile picking up trash from under the seat. And then she will move down to here, and I'm going to skip ahead to that section where she leaves the frame, and the camera holds on the frame for quite a while. But this is all within one shot. It's a very long take. Okay, as I said, this shot then goes on for about another 2 minutes. I'm not going to show the whole thing because I have other clips that I want to show, and I think it would take far too long. Goodbye Dragon Inn is set in a dilapidated movie theater on the verge of destruction, the attendants sparse on the final night, and the narrative a chronicle of missed sexual encounters, if you can call it a narrative. Present are two of the now older actors in the film that is being projected, which is a martial arts film. Hence, the film is very much about pastness, memory, and a nostalgia for a cinema that seemed to address a certain longing. Similarly, Sugimoto chose old movie palaces, reminiscent of a different era, and drive-ins on the verge of cultural extinction for his reduction of temporality to a static luminosity. However, the reverse shot, if it can be called that, constituted by the shot in Goodbye Dragon Inn, is not head-on or centered, but somewhat awry, seeming to be anchored by a canted point of view from the right half of the screen. The perspective of the shot seems skewed, the light's not quite in the right place, the seats somehow out of line, out of kilter. This effect is intensified when the cleaning woman leaves the frame by the lack of movement, the usual marker of the passage of time in a film's diegesis. There is too much time, in this case, to study or analyze the space and its apparent deficiencies, but in a different way than in Sugimoto's theater series, where the excess of time effects an ontological transformation of time into light. Without the assistance of movement or sound, after the cleaning woman's footsteps diminish in the distance, the shot in Chai Ming Liang's film becomes photograph-like. It is very difficult to distinguish between it and a still image. One of the most important differences, of course, is that Goodbye Dragon Inn dictates the duration of its own viewing, while Sugimoto's photographs cannot. The viewer can move on to the next exhibit whenever he or she desires. In the theater series, time is absent but represented. It has a stand-in. In Dragon Inn, the experience of time is both intensified and abandoned. There is a sense in which both works translate time into space. I have dwelled on these two textual moments because both can be seen as responses to and instantiations of the recurrent theoretical and philosophical insistence upon the spatialization of time as a fundamental characteristic of modernity and postmodernity. From Henri Bergson to Frederick Jameson, two very different types of theorists, we can witness the chronicling of a loss in which the experience of time as duration, flow, historicity is replaced by the quantification or mathematization of time, and hence its transformation into a static, spatial, divisible entity. Ultimately, in Jameson, this becomes an argument about the contemporary investment in presence and instantaneity and a corresponding repression of history. Theorists of modernity generally link the spatialization of time to the processes of industrialization and its increasing technological sophistication, the development of train schedules, the need for a standardization of time, the conquering of space and time associated with imperialism, Taylorization, and the relation between clock time and labor time. According to Henri Lefebvre, before modernity, time was embedded in space. It was experienced as the relation of the sun to the horizon, the position of stars in the sky, the passing of seasons, the temperature of the air, etc. However, quote, with the advent of modernity, time has vanished from social space. It is recorded solely on measuring instruments, on clocks that are as isolated and functionally specialized as this time itself. Lived time loses its form and its social interest, with the exception, that is, of time spent working. Economic space subordinates time to itself. Political space expels it as threatening and dangerous to power. The primacy of the economic, and above all of the political, implies the supremacy of space over time. Our time, then, this most essential part of lived experience, this greatest good of all goods, is no longer visible to us, no longer intelligible. It cannot be constructed. It is consumed, exhausted, and that is all. It leaves no traces. It is concealed in space, hidden under a pile of debris to be disposed of as soon as possible. This manifest expulsion of time is arguably one of the hallmarks of modernity, unquote. Time has been traditionally analyzed as the continuity par excellence, indivisible, lived, homogeneous, and therefore irredeemably qualitative. It has also been thought as inevitably subjective, something that it is impossible to objectify or externalize, an inescapable attribute of the subject. Urban space, industrialization, the era of the machine have all conspired to steal time from the subject and return it as commodity. George Lukács, in History and Class Consciousness, claimed that in modernity, quote, time sheds its qualitative, variable, flowing nature. It freezes into an exactly delineated, quantifiable continuum filled with quantifiable things. In short, it becomes space, unquote. The ontological assumption undergirding this argument is that time is inherently indivisible, while space is easily and efficiently divisible. Bergson was perhaps the first to explore and fully develop this idea, linking its necessity to the essential nature of time rather than the historical context of modernity. His philosophy locates the truth of time in its fluidity, its duration, its fullness and continuity. Yet our everyday notion of time, its usefulness for us, results in, quote, a sort of refracting of pure duration into space, unquote. Cinema, for Bergson, given its dissection of time into the static instance represented by frames whose movement through the projector only appears to represent real movement, is the technological incarnation of this false thinking about time. For Bergson, the basic unit demarcated here, the instant, is unthinkable, an impossibility. From his point of view, there is no real movement or time in the cinema. We can only generate the concept of the instant by translating time into space. In the case of movement as the most visible embodiment of time, the movement is confused with its trajectory through space, and it is by dividing that spatial trajectory into units that we arrive at the concept of the instant. But true movement is between static states and is not their simple accumulation. It, like time, is ungraspable, antithetical to divisibility. Hence, for Bergson, there is no such thing as the present. Quote, practically, we perceive only the past, the pure present being the invisible progress of the past gnawing into the future, unquote. The spatializing of time for Bergson is the effect of two urges that have their source in practicality or use value. The desire to envisage time, like space, as divisible, and the desire to conceptualize time, epitomized by memory, as storable, hence locatable in space. There is a predilection, according to Bergson, to perceive space as a container, faithfully preserving all of its objects in simultaneity. Time, on the other hand, vanishes as it passes, revealing a material instability and an existential frailty. The existence of space seems more assured precisely because it is external to the subject, consciousness, while time, because it is an internalized attribute of consciousness, is never quite as real. Bergson produces a diagram to explicate the forcefulness of this way of thinking. And I've replicated the diagram here. The line AB, will be this line here, represents all simultaneous objects in space, while CI contains successive recollections in time. Each of the lines is indefinitely extendable and therefore includes both actual and virtual perceptions of the subject. But the point I, right here, where the two intersect, on the line of time, is, according to Bergson, quote, the only one actually given to consciousness, unquote. And therefore, the present is the only form of temporality to which we attribute reality, existence, while we readily assume that the objects in the line AB that are outside the range of our perception do have reality, even though we might not be able to see them. In other words, we accept virtuality in space more readily than virtuality in time. Bergson asserts that the threads of the confusion and denial in this understanding are difficult to disentangle. Quote, in order to unmask the illusion entirely, we should have to seek its origin and follow through all its windings, the double movement by which we come to assume objective realities without relation to consciousness and states of consciousness without objective reality. Space thus appearing to preserve indefinitely the things which are there juxtaposed, while time in its advance devours the states which succeed each other within it, unquote. Time disappears as it advances. This suggests an aporia in the thinking of a relation between time and storage. And Bergson raises the question that also perplexed Freud: where are memories stored? Yet for Freud, the problem of storage had to do with the inevitable finitude and hence exhaustibility of the space of inscription of memories, a dilemma he solved by translating the question of space into one of time and its intermittency in the essay, The Mystic Writing Pad. Bergson argues that the question of storage is from the outset a spatial one and cannot be applied to time and memory. Given the enormous influence of the spatial paradigm, we are inevitably led to assume that if the past is retained, it must be located somewhere. Bergson asserts that we mistakenly apply the spatial status of container and contained to the temporal phenomenon of memory. Yet Bergson is ultimately interested, as the title of his book indicates, not in space and time, but in matter and memory. And materiality, like time, is not divisible for Bergson. Everything merges into everything else. There are no natural outlines or boundaries. We deposit a divisible space beneath and as a support for the division of things and our action upon them. Because we tend to understand movement as only a variation of distance, space becomes primary and original. It is thought to precede and lay the ground for motion. Divisibility for Bergson is merely a handy tool enabling human action. It has nothing to do with knowledge. True knowledge of time and matter would entail the acceptance of time as pure, indivisible duration and matter as absolute continuity. Nevertheless, one gets the sense with Bergson that matter, due to its intimate relation with space, is inherently more subject to divisibility than time. The real epistemological crime for Bergson is that against temporality. For Frederick Jameson, on the other hand, temporality is significant primarily as historicity. And what is lost in postmodernity is precisely that sense of being in time and in history. Everything is presence, instantaneity, receiving technological assistance from, or perhaps produced by the technology of computers, television, and cell phones. We are, as Jameson claims, quote, now exposed to a perceptual barrage of immediacy from which all sheltering layers and intervening mediations have been removed, unquote. Space is saturated and time can be represented, written, but it is no longer lived. For Jameson, the spatialization of time constitutes the, quote, great transformation, unquote, of postmodernism. Quote, the displacement of time, the spatialization of the temporal, often registers its novelties by way of a sense of loss. What is mourned is the memory of deep memory, unquote. Ironically, this spatialization is especially characteristic of media that we usually think of as time-based. film, video, television. And for Jameson, there is a sense in which all of the media cannot refrain from absorbing and commenting on the other media. Mediation is not simply the insertion of a distance between subject and event, but the negotiation of relations between the various media, a form of reflexivity about the ontology of mediums. In the course of analyzing an installation by Gober, Jameson claims that, quote, we may speak of spatialization here as the process whereby the traditional fine arts are mediatized. That is, they now come to consciousness of themselves as various media within a mediatic system in which their own internal production also constitutes a symbolic message and the taking of a position on the status of the medium in question, unquote. Rather than dealing with history or time and memory, the media tend to situate themselves within a synchronic spatial network of other media, redeploying, recycling the products of these media. Sugimoto's theater series, in its exploitation and absorption of the cinema by photography, participates in this spatializing reflexivity. A film unrolling in time becomes the static concentration of a radiant light, light itself being, in a sense, the basic material of photography. What inevitably draws the eye in this series is a blank in the middle of the image, a nothingness that is the residue of the collapse of time into space. That blank also points to a forgetting that, according to Bergson, is crucial to the operation of memory, which only retains and activates that which is relevant to the present. Chris Marker, in Sans Soleil, relates a story about a future race in which everyone remembers everything. There is no forgetting. But this absence of an absence entails the annihilation of memory and hence of time. Because everything is present, always, there is no past. Memory depends upon forgetting, loss. Perhaps we can understand the spatialization of time in relation to cinema, not in terms of what is there and how it is represented, but in terms of what is left out, absent. The off-screen time that is analogous to off-screen space. A temporal hiatus in film is made possible by editing, the operation of the cut, but not any cut, the cut that figures an ellipsis, and hence acts as a true cinematic trope. The cut does not necessarily signify a change in time. It may simply represent a variation in space that is characterized by simultaneity rather than succession, in parallel editing, for instance, or through a change of angle within the same general space. However, a cut that does signal a change in time, or the loss of time, must almost always be accompanied by a change in space. Indeed, it is difficult to imagine any other way of signifying that time has been lost when a straight cut, rather than a dissolve or fade out, fade in, is in question. Here in the ellipsis, the cut conjoins the operations of space and time. It is possible to see Sugimoto's theater series as the meta-representation of this cut, the representation of that which enables lost time in the cinema. Time is here transformed into an illegible image, an empty diegetic space. And since an ellipsis in narrative is a condensation of time, the photograph is an extreme form of ellipsis, indeed hyperbolic, condensing all time to a moment. We know ellipsis primarily as a grammatical operation of omission, an omission that is syntactical and hence linked to the temporal dimension of language. It is also often defined as producing a meaning that is unfinished or incomplete, but nevertheless implied, understood. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the grammatical definition of ellipsis is, quote, the omission of one or more words in a sentence which would be needed to complete the grammatical construction or fully to express the sense, unquote. Wikipedia defines a grammatical ellipsis as, quote, a construction that lacks an element that is nevertheless recoverable or inferable from the context. The elliptical construction is a sequence of words in which some words have been omitted. Because of the logic or pattern of the entire sentence, it is easy to infer what the missing words are, unquote. A linguistic ellipsis is, quote, meaning without form, unquote. And one more, Wikipedia also defines a narrative ellipsis as, quote, the narrative device of omitting a portion of the sequence of events, allowing the reader to fill in the narrative gaps. An ellipsis in narrative leaves out a portion of the story. This can be used to condense time or as a stylistic method to allow the reader to fill in the missing portions of the narrative with their imagination. And what I wanted to point out about this series of definitions is primarily that they all somehow reference the idea that it's easy to fill in this gap, that any reader can see what is missing somehow in the ellipsis, that it's very strongly implied, very strongly suggested, and very much recoverable or recuperable. In film, what is implied and understood by the ellipsis is lost time. Often in the classical film, this time will be understood as inconsequential, trivial, often a matter of transporting characters from one space to another, or as excluding empty time, that is, things like sleeping or brushing teeth of characters, etc. In alternative cinemas, the question of empty and full time, what constitutes significant time, becomes more complex, as in Chai Ming Liang's Goodbye Dragon Inn. The only etymology provided for the term ellipsis in the OED is, interestingly, an etymology corresponding to a rare or obsolete usage of the term, a geometrical usage in which the ellipsis is a conical section. Ellipsis is derived from the Greek and means, concerning an action, to come short. Short of words, short of time, but itself figurative, the etymology effectively turns time into distance, space. The ellipsis allows time to be contracted, condensed, and is the condition of the possibility of cinema's aspiration to package, to commodify temporality. Despite its alliance with real time, with flow, with continuity, cinema still strives for the reduction of time and space, consistent, as I have tried to demonstrate elsewhere, with its understanding of the image in relation to the category of the point. And the cut is the most exemplary cinematic operation in this regard, for the cut is the haunting echo of the frame line, its reiteration at a different level. The cut reasserts the instantaneity of the individual photogram. Time is subject to a miniaturization, a contraction. It becomes something that can be held or possessed in a metaphorical sense. This is why the cut as ellipsis is a crucial figure. Time becomes delimitable, commodifiable, object-like. The long take, in contrast, is a gaze at an autonomous, unfolding scene whose duration is a function of the duration and potential waywardness of events themselves. Its length situates it as an invitation to chance and unpredictability, an invitation which is abruptly canceled by the cut. The cut is the mechanism whereby temporality becomes a product of the apparatus, repudiating the role of cinema as simply a record of time outside itself. If Bergson is correct in claiming that we tend to see space as, quote, appearing to preserve indefinitely the things which are there juxtaposed, while time in its advance devours the states which succeed each other within it, unquote, then the spatialization of time contributes to the thingification, the commodification of temporality. Curiously, the representation of time as reproducible disavows any relation to temporality. A reproducible time pretends that it is liberated from temporality, from historicity. This problematic is most strongly visible in a form of filmmaking that is generally maligned or disparaged, relegated to the margins of the cinema proper, the trailer. The trailer is perhaps the ultimate film about a film. even more so than the making of blank genre, the making of Star Wars genre, or the making of the Matrix genre of film. Because it is composed, the trailer is composed primarily of shots from the film itself, as opposed to behind the scenes shots, as the making of blank genre is. In Jameson's terms, it would be the epitome of reflexivity, insofar as reflexivity implies an acknowledgement of positioning within a mediatic system. But its functioning, unlike that of the works, that is contemporary high art, that Jameson discusses in this context, is to elicit desire for another work, desire for the film. The trailer is a very strictly coded, rule-governed form, even genre. It has a fairly limited set of conventions, not all of which will be activated in any particular trailer. And I know that you've all seen trailers before, but I'm going to show 4 different trailers, and I can do this in their entirety since they're really about 2 or 3 minutes long, some even less than that, because I want to look a little more closely about at the way that trailers actually work in relation to temporality. Okay, the first one is Gangs of New York. Sorry, I want to start that at the very beginning.
Anything in your pockets tonight?
Oh, I ain't started working yet.
What about that locket that I gave you? Enough of this heathen music! This is a night for Americans! That's the building of our country right there, Mr. Cuddy. Americans are burning. I don't see no Americans. I see trespassers. His name's Amsterdam. The appearance of the law must be upheld, especially while it's been broken. A man who will fight for freedom.
There's more of us coming off these ships every day. 15,000 Irish a week.
A man who will kill for power. Mulberry Street and Worth. Cross, Orange, and Little Water. Each of the 5 points is a finger. When I close my hand, it becomes a fist. Whip spats, axes, knives. Pistols? No pistols. Good boy.
I give you my word. This will all be finished tomorrow.
No, it won't.
Okay, I think that's about the longest one. The second one I'd like to show is Spider-Man.
I told you I was... Who am I? You sure you want to know? If somebody told you I was just your average, ordinary guy, not a care in the world, somebody lied. Truth is, it wasn't always like this. There was a time when life was a lot less complicated. Can I take your picture for the school paper?
Sure. genetically enhanced super spiders.
There's 14. One's missing.
Are you alright? I'm fine.
Hey, look, you're changing. I know I'm gonna do exactly the same thing at your age.
No, not exactly.
Wow.
You ever introduce my father to anyone else, boy?
Great honor to meet you, sir.
Harry tells me you're quite the science whiz. And I'm something of a scientist myself.
Whatever it is, somebody has to stop it.
With great power comes great responsibility.
This is my gift.
Wow.
It is my curse.
Who are you?
Who am I? I'm Spider-Man.
Do I get to say thank you this time?
Too much. You're not Superman, you know.
And the third is vantage point, which is fairly recent.
Ground.
Here we go in 3, 2.
Here in Salamanca, Spain, President Ashton has been working with leaders from 5 continents to forge a new groundbreaking alliance.
Today, we make history. 8 strangers, each with a different vantage point.
The President of the United States has been shot.
I need your camera. There was something in that window. I saw something too. We have to respond. You can't give the order. You've been shot. The risk telling the world that you weren't really there.
We weren't there.
Secret Service, we need to see your tapes. Rewind that.
Oh my God.
What did he say?
There's something else going on here.
Ben's Quaid,
Control is compromised.
Matthew Fox, Forrest Whitaker,
I think I just told a guy who did it.
with Sigourney Weaver,
There's no 20 on the president.
and William Hurt.
Where is it?
If you think you've seen it all, look again.
Go, go!
Vantage point.
And the last one I want to show is a slightly different kind of film. It's an independent film by Todd Haynes about Bob Dylan. And the trailer is somewhat different, but it has lots of similarities to the other.
I can't watch this.
Okay, you're left with Bergson. In all of these trailers, the materials utilized include graphics, music, voiceover, dialogue, dissolves, as well as cuts and shots from the object film. The shots are generally tense or heavily emotive moments of the narrative. For example, the shot in the Spider-Man trailer chronicling the drop of blood or the knife scene in Gangs of New York. There is a strong work of identification paralleling the name brand of the commodity form, beginning with the marked announcement of the name of the producer or distributor, Miramax, Columbia, etc., and continuing with the listing either through graphics or voiceover or both of the film's stars or director as lure. The fragmentation of the form is compensated for by an explanatory power that resides in the classic, heavy, and necessarily male voiceover in Vantage Point and Gangs of New York, or the narration of a character in Spider-Man, or in graphics that are often redundant in relation to a voiceover, as though the extreme abbreviation of time mandated repetitiveness. A continuity that also works to counter the fragmentation is provided by dialogue that often spans shots taken from different scenes, as in the 5 fingers and fist sequence from Gangs of New York. Shock value and spectacle are paramount. Almost invariably, the first third or half of a trailer is devoted to a more or less coherent but highly condensed clarification of the narrative and introduction to the characters. It is in this section that devices to provide continuity and ward off the threat of meaninglessness are most in evidence. And I think Spider-Man seems to be most successful at this, perhaps because of its skeletal narrative. I haven't seen Spider-Man, but I know the entire story from having watched the trailer. I don't know how it ends, although I can suspect, but the narrative is actually very clearly and coherently given in that particular trailer, whereas this is not at all always the case, as in Gangs of New York, where I think it's much more complicated, and Vantage Point as well. But toward the end of the trailer, the speed of the editing is intensified and becomes a spectacle in its own right, often accompanied by dramatic music or choreographed sound effects. In the last section of the trailer for Vantage Point, there are 7 shots in 1 second. Intelligibility is not the stake here. Rather, what seems to be involved is an assault on the spectator's senses, particularly sight. Vantage Point self-reflexively refers to this visual barrage when both the graphics and voiceover proclaim, "If you think you've seen it all, look again," followed later by an extreme close-up of a pair of eyes, a shot so short that its perception is almost subliminal. And I wanted to just show you that particular shot, which is hard to find, actually, because it's so short.
Here we go in 3.
Vantage Point.
Oops. Okay, it's very hard to get it. This is the shot I'm talking about. And it's followed by 2 other shots of his face and eyes that are not as close. I don't want to do that. These are the other shots that I'm referring to. And I don't know how long that shot is, but it's between those 2. It's so short that I can't even get it very well. The trailer of the alternative independent film I'm Not There counters this with a refusal, Cate Blanchett declaring, "I can't watch this," seemingly referring to a huge pair of images of Lyndon Johnson, but with hints of unwatchability, the failure of vision, as a significant theme. Despite its independence, the I'm Not There trailer adheres fairly closely to the generic conventions of the trailer, activating graphics, music, and fast editing, and introducing its stars, but with the significant omissions of a deep male voiceover and any sense of a standard conventional narrative. It also visibly plays ironically with the conventions of the trailer. For example, with the inspired by a true, false, authentic, exaggerated story graphics. The concept of identity, so readily accepted and exploited in Spider-Man, is problematized in I'm Not There. These generic conventions of the trailer generate a rudimentary meaning, a sense of the film's narrative or theme. But what I am most interested in is the surplus or excess over and beyond this meaning, the supplemental effect of the trailer. And this surplus or supplement resides ironically in the ellipsis, the intensification or magnification of the work of the ellipsis that defines these trailers. Now, I think it's clearly the case that there's been a historical change in trailers, and that the kind of trailers I'm talking about are very contemporary. In other words, as you get closer to the present moment, you get faster and faster editing in trailers. If you look back at 80s film like Scarface, for instance, the trailer is actually very, very slow compared to these. There are also other trailers that are not all characterized by fast editing. In fact, one of the versions of The Hills Have Eyes has a trailer that's simply one shot long. So there are exceptions to this rule, but nevertheless, I do think it's a very marked tendency in contemporary cinema to have trailers with extremely fast editing. Given the trailer's tremendous temporal restrictions in relation to the length of the film it is advertising, its ellipses cannot carry meaning as the figure does in the film itself. For the elements that it bridges, that it is between, are undecidable, meaning usually seen as so easily inferred from or implied by the ellipsis, easy to fill in, understood, is not recuperable here. The gaps are too large and the trailer too saturated by its accelerating series of ellipses. This ellipsis is rendered inoperative, disabled by its very proliferation. It becomes sheer form or device without content. Or perhaps more accurately, its only content is absence, lost time no longer propped up by meaning, but vacated, naked, exposed as a failed figure, a tropological ghost. The trailer is the strongly honed art of ellipsis, but it activates an ellipsis deprived of its semantic dimension and intensified as the carrier of loss. It perfects the labor of the absenting, elision, disappearance of time marked by the ellipsis. In the space of, and the phrase is telling here, in the space of 2 or 3 minutes, I don't know how that translates into Spanish, but it's telling in English, the trailer must condense or contract the time of a 2-hour film, suggesting its pleasures or thrills, but it does not communicate them, it mimes them. This is why most, but not all trailers are characterized by extremely rapid editing, each shot a matter of seconds or less. The fascination of the trailer is, at least in part, the lure of speed, of instantaneity. As a microcosm of the film itself, the trailer replicates its condensation of time, generating an experience of temporality. What is omitted above all and necessarily is the ending, the narrative closure, precisely in order to leave open the question, the enigma that drives the film, to widen the tantalizing gap through which the spectator must fall. For Bergson, our thinking insists that space is open, time is closed, for space is extendable, seemingly infinitely, and we readily accept the idea that there are horizons of objects beyond the horizons that bind our current perception. Because we measure time as distance, the future becomes a space that opens up before us, with a distance that we cannot anticipate but know is there. Our perception of space appears to us as a content that is always included within a vaster container, invisible to us but nevertheless posited as actuality. And the unseen objects within it acquire the characteristic of actuality as well. For Bergson, quote, while we feel ourselves to be dependent upon these material objects, which we thus erect into present realities, our memories, on the contrary, inasmuch as they are past, are so much dead weight that we carry with us, and by which we prefer to imagine ourselves unencumbered. The same instinct, in virtue of which we open out space indefinitely before us, prompts us to shut off time behind us as it flows, unquote. Trailers spatialize time, transform it into an object by condensing and commodifying it, yet leaving it open. As commodity, the trailer is never quite enough to satisfy desire and inserts itself within a chain of commodities, leading not only to the film it advertises, but to the cinema itself and its continual generation of more objects of desire. The trailer, any trailer, is selling the cinema itself. The trailer works by foregrounding and insisting upon the gap, the absence, the ellipsis that is the condition of possibility of the condensation of time in the cinema. It is a syntax of ellipses, where absence far outweighs presence, but absolute presence is simulated. But what does the form of the trailer have to do with either Sugimoto's theater series or Chai Ming Liang's Goodbye Dragon Inn? Especially since these works occupy different sides of the divide that is still with us, that between high and low culture. The relationships between time and space produced by these very different works are not the same, but they all address, in some way, shape, or form, modernity's spatialization of time. In the trailer, time is spatialized to facilitate its commodification. What the trailer sells is a particular experience of time, that of the film. It heightens and exemplifies the condensation, that is, the packaging of time, that characterizes most Hollywood films, especially today. In comparison with the trailer, Sugimoto's photos are an even more extreme contraction of time into an instant, and an even more extreme transformation of time into space in another medium, photography. They effectively accomplish what the trailer only strives for as a goal. The film here is completely divorced from meaning, from intelligibility, and reduced to a rectangle of light, a sheer special effect, spectacular in its excessive luminosity. The translation of cinema into photography also effects an altered temporality, since photography always connotes, as Roland Barthes has demonstrated, a that has been, as opposed to the cinema's adherence to an experience of presence. This is a cinema, the cinema of ornate picture palaces, that has largely vanished, just as the cinema in Goodbye Dragon Inn is about to be demolished. But perhaps it is also cinema itself, in the face of new technologies of digital representation, whose disappearance is being heralded as a future past. There is another artist who has collapsed the time of film into a single moment, a single image, working not in photochemically based photography, as Sugimoto does in the theater series, but in digital photography. 4 of the photographs in Jim Campbell's Illuminated Average series, this is a series as well, utilize the same technique. In Illuminated Average number 1, Hitchcock's Psycho, Campbell scanned all of the frames in Psycho and then merged them all into a single image. And I have some instances of this series as well. Okay, this is the Hitchcock's Psycho. And then Citizen Kane, The Wizard of Oz, and this is the dynamism of the news. But I'm going to concentrate on Hitchcock's Psycho. The concern here is not so much with light, as in Sugimoto's photographs, but with the accumulation of data. All of the visual data in Psycho is in the image, but its legibility is compromised. It is as if the image were an incarnation of Freud's mystic writing pad, his technical apparatus for representing memory, without the mechanism of erasure, which for Freud was equivalent to conscious forgetting, but opened up the possibility of unconscious storage. It is a demonstration of the dependence of legible memory upon forgetting, loss. Time is again spatialized, but this is a new space, a virtual space, whose code is generative but not visible. Sugimoto's intense, annihilating luminosity is in the center of the image, but in the darker edges, objects are still, to some extent, recognizable. A lamp, for instance, on the right side of the frame, perhaps demonstrating the significance of centering the gaze in the Hollywood cinema. There's too much information in the center. And you can just faintly see the lamp on the upper right-hand corner of the frame here. Campbell was influenced by the Italian futurists, particularly Umberto Bocciani. One of the works in the series is entitled Dynamism of a Cyclist, 2001, after Umberto Boccioni. And the futurists attempt, in the practice of photodynamism, to represent movement by leaving the shutter open and hence layering image over image. In Campbell's Illuminated Average series, vision is subject to a mathematics of averaging brightness and contrast, reducing all of the film's time to a moment understood as an average, but deprived of narrative or temporal meaning. The series is, like Sugimoto's, an extreme instance of the spatialization of time, one which activates cinema but shatters its representation of temporality. In the shot of the empty auditorium from Chai Ming Liang's Goodbye Dragon Inn, the film within the film is also annihilated by the turn away from it to the auditorium. Extreme duration characterizes not only this shot, but all of the shots in the film, and the long take is characteristic of not only Chai Ming Liang's work, but that of the new Taiwan cinema in general. The length of Goodbye Dragon Inn could easily match that of the film shown in the theater, with no ellipses whatsoever. In fact, the use of shots of great duration, which convey real time in its technical sense, constitutes a refusal of ellipses and an insistence upon experienced rather than abbreviated, highly condensed time. In Chantal Ackerman's Jean Dielman, the use of extremely long takes covering everyday actions like shopping, cleaning, and making meatloaf upsets the classical hierarchy of full time over empty time. This real time is not the same as the time of the television reality show, where the marker of the real is not a formal or technical one, but one of contents, real people, real unscripted situations. In Goodbye Dragon Inn, however, we do not experience the real time of being a spectator watching the film within the film. Instead, we are shown the activities and interactions that occupy the margins of the screen. It's outside, everything except the film itself, which is shown only in glimpses. Spectators interacting through gazes or propped feet or seating choices, people wandering the hallways outside the auditorium or frequenting the toilets. The movement usually conveyed by editing or camera movement is transferred to the restless wandering of spectators who never quite make contact with each other. The space, however, is very intensely present. It is a space of exaggerated perspective, with long hallways leading back to a strongly marked vanishing point. And I have a few examples of this as well. Perspective adamantly asserts, against all knowledge, the depth of the image. It is a marker of the very spatiality of space. Time is experienced as duration in Goodbye Dragon Inn, but it becomes the time also of a very intense sense of space. Sugimoto's and Campbell's photographs, as well as Goodbye Dragon Inn, cancel or collapse the work of ellipsis. All time is there, but illegible in the photographs. In the film, all time is there, but becomes only empty duration, awaiting for something to happen in a space whose spatiality is amplified. Trailers, on the other hand, hyperbolize the work of ellipsis, of lost time in the service of commodification. Yet all of these works inhabit the same mediatic system, as Jameson would say, and refer to and reflect each other in myriad ways. The extended duration of Goodbye Dragon Inn can only be experienced and attended to in relation to the fast-paced time of the Hollywood thriller and the trailer. Filmic time can be contained and canceled by photographic time in Sugimoto's and Campbell's photographs, and Goodbye Dragon Inn is just as susceptible to Sugimoto's open shutter or Campbell's illuminating averages as any other film. Trailers achieve their spectacular impact through an implicit comparison with the long take and its temporality of boredom. The works inhabit the same mediatic system, but each occupies a different point in that system, some straining more than others to not only instantiate it, but to disrupt it, to put pressure on its weakest points, to theorize it, in short. For Bergson, the spatialization of time is a product of everyday thinking, but does violence to the essential nature of time. Time in his philosophy is not subject to historical pressure. Modernity cannot touch it. For Jameson, the spatialization of time is a negative characteristic of postmodernity because it contributes to the inability to think history and historicity. Has time become space? The question is unanswerable because the very act of posing it takes place within the same mediatic system, and in addition, assumes that these categories, space and time, could have completely separable identities. As Jameson has said, there is no question of time completely disappearing under the assault of space. Each era produces and posits its own relationship between space and time, and understanding that relationship is crucial to even begin to interrogate the systematicity of capital. But the mechanical and electronic representation of time has, along with other factors, made time subject to a form of representation, highly reproducible, easy to transmit globally, that has undeniably transformed its status and effects. It is not immediately clear how aesthetic practice can counter or resist this systematicity, or even whether these are the terms that should be invoked. But it can contribute to the analysis of this system, not through the promise of nostalgically returning us to a prior condition in which time was authentically experienced, but by inhabiting in an extreme way and putting pressure on the logic of a spatialization that strives to take time and return it as object. Perhaps the only thing that can be said is that this spatialization is, quite literally, taking place. Thank you.
Si hay alguna pregunta. Espera. ¿No? Vale. Yo voy a hacer una pregunta, la traduzco inmediatamente después de formularla. I did sort of wonder, I know this is kind of a bit transversal to your main topic, but you made like a passing mention to
reality TV, which I thought, and it just seems to me that you know, it's this whole new genre, and also, you know, the whole idea of like internet webcams, where that whole downtime seems to be the main content, and yet it seems to be consumed in a completely different way. So
I think there's a real difference between.
Maybe you need to. Just so that. Maybe I can hear you.
I think that there's a large difference between reality TV shows and webcam. Mostly because reality TV shows, at least in my experience of them, which is fairly limited, I have to admit, have always shocked me because they don't, in fact, for the most part, utilize real time in the technical sense. And by that I mean the use of long takes and very, very little editing, which I would have assumed. But in fact, the reality, you know, doesn't reside there as it would with something like cinema verite or other forms of film that assume that editing is a kind of manipulation of temporality and therefore unreal. But they are fairly heavily edited. And so the reality effect in reality TV is provided primarily by the people in them who are not actors, but are allegedly real people, like you and me, or by the situations, which are not scripted, not narrative, not scripted. Although obviously some of the games, you know, surviving and that kind of thing are clearly scripted in some way, but there's a possibility of contingency. But I think that the contingency is really reined in reality shows. And but some of you may be able to come up with counterexamples, and I'd love to hear them because as I say, you know, reality TV, I just haven't seen enough of it, mostly because I don't like it. And webcam, I actually have looked at a few, you know, webcam, some of the sort of classic ones, like the one that Victor Bergen wrote about, Jenny's Space, is that the name of it? Which I actually find incredibly intriguing. And I think at least her technology was so limited that she really couldn't, I mean, she would refresh the image every once in a while, but you wouldn't really have this sense of flow or continuity that you do in a real-time shot in the cinema. But nevertheless, the idea of keeping a camera, you know, aimed at one's living space, you know, 24 hours a day, and what would actually be the interest or the value of that or the fascination of that is really kind of intriguing to me, much more so than I think reality shows, at least in experiencing them. As a phenomenon, I think they're sociologically and analytically and ideologically interesting. But the idea of, you know, positing a spectator who would sit in front of the computer all day to watch and see what Jenny does is kind of amazing, I guess. But obviously that doesn't happen. You know, people come and go. It's a form of spectatorship. You can hook in and see what she's doing at this particular time and then that particular time. YouTube is another kind of phenomenon that's very similar to that. And I haven't watched enough YouTube to know how much the long take is used in YouTube, but I think it is used fairly frequently because what's at stake is often people's self-exhibition that takes place in one shot. But I think that with the computer, there's a sense in which the computer and these uses of real time on the computer really duplicates an experience of the earliest cinema, when, in fact, films weren't shown in theaters. You weren't sitting in a seat looking straight ahead. They weren't shown necessarily in complete darkness. You weren't expected to be quiet. People could come and go, that kind of cinema. And also some of the avant-garde cinema of the 50s and 60s. I'm thinking particularly of Andy Warhol's use of film, which again was not simply to be looked at in one sitting in a theatrical space facing the screen, but would often be shown on walls at parties and people could come and go. And the same is true of some of Michael Snow's work. The Rameau's Nephew or some of the longer works would operate in that kind of way. And so it seems to me, and that avant-garde often deliberately invoked the earliest films with that form of spectatorship, or inviting that form of spectatorship. And they invoked earlier films in many different kinds of ways as well. But I think that reality, the concept of real time in the technical sense, okay, this idea of sheer recording of a time that's out there, has always been very intriguing to me. And I think it has to do with modes of spectatorship, with questions of what constitutes boredom and what constitutes interest, which is obviously a social, cultural, historical, ideological phenomenon, and not something inherent to the kinds of works that are being discussed. I don't know if that addresses your question, but...
Yeah, no, I must say, I think my only experience of reality TV was something called Big Brother and Cat, in which they show you people sleeping and things like that. But I think you're probably right, because I think that the normal...
How long? How long were they sleeping?
When it first started in Channel 4 in Britain, there was kind of like a parallel channel pretty much devoted to it. But you had to have satellite and be very bored. And then you could watch like unedited versions of it. But of course, I think normally you would just watch it over an hour in the evening when it's much more,
fast-paced.
But yeah.
There's also another piece. I can't remember the name of I should remember the name of the soccer player. Beckham, was it Beckham? And there was a very long shot of him simply sleeping that was shown in the National Portrait Museum, right? And when I went to see it, I sat down they provide a couch for some reason for you to sit and watch him sleeping. And a mother and her young son came in and sat down. And I thought he must have been about 5-6 years old. His reaction to this image and this long take of Beckham sleeping was very interesting. He didn't say anything about, wow, when is this going to be over? He said, when is he going to wake up? And the idea of watching somebody sleep didn't appeal to him. The idea of watching a long shot was not even within the range of his, possible commentary, I suppose, at that age. But so I think it's quite interesting that the proliferation of different types of works that are, in both popular culture and high culture that are dealing with the question of time in this way, and the question of duration, pure duration, and what it means to record, without cutting, without editing, without that particular kind of manipulation of time. It's not that this is real time in any real sense, because it's recorded time, and because it's reproducible, it's distributable, it's movable across different cultures, etc., different places, and it does become a kind of product or object, but of an entirely different kind of sort, I think.
Hola. Últimamente se produce una aceleración en la imagen, en edición, aceleración del tiempo, por ejemplo, o deceleración. Este cambio en el tiempo real en la imagen considera que es una forma de elipsis, y si es así, el espacio quedaría vacío también.
He thinks that there's been a process of acceleration of images, like the time of the images has come faster. So if you agree with that, will space be rendered empty by that process?
I'm not exactly sure why it would be rendered empty by the process, because it seems to me that process of acceleration is more detrimental to time than space. And part of the argument about the spatialization of time has to do with this acceleration of editing, which takes place primarily, I think, within popular culture. I think that's one of the reasons why the thriller as a genre is very, very important in Hollywood right now. But I'm trying to argue in the paper that the faster the editing, in most cases, this is not always true, the more spatialized time becomes, especially with the use of ellipses, larger and larger ellipses. So space would not be emptied out. Instead, this process would contribute to, what Jameson refers to as a spatialization of time in postmodernity, that it's actually time that gets emptied out rather than space. But I'm not sure that I entirely grasped the import of the question. Maybe you were really asking something else.
Me refería a que en la línea de tiempo de una edición, de un programa de edición, por ejemplo, al acelerar la imagen se condensa ese tiempo. Entonces, esa condensación podría ser similar a una elipsis de tiempo, en lugar de por corte, por aceleración.
I was thinking of, for example, when you're editing film, with software, the timeline. Mm-hmm. When you accelerate the image, the timeline gets contracted, you said. Me dijiste, cuando aceleras la imagen, la línea de tiempo se contrae. Right. Mm. Right. So he's wondering whether that doesn't kind of provoke a temporal ellipsis in itself.
A temporal ellipsis or a spatial?
No, a temporal one.
Temporal ellipsis.
Or could that be thought of as some kind of ellipsis, or would that be something else?
That's a very interesting question. Since I've never edited digitally, but only in old-fashioned film, but I know that is how it's done, and I've dabbled in it a bit. And so you're saying that when you accelerate time, the line gets shorter. So that would actually mean that, not that space is being emptied out necessarily, but that being diminished, or even that, what's interesting to me about that process, which I hadn't thought about in relation to this paper, so I'm very grateful you asked about it, is that time is completely linear in that construction, right? It's a line, it's an arrow, that's all. And I think that, to me, is the most interesting aspect of digital editing, is the way that time, becomes linear. I'm not sure what that would mean in relation to the ellipsis. I do know that digital editing in many ways is based on film. It takes some of the same categories, the bin, the separation of shots and that kind of thing, which is probably predictable because it builds on the previous medium. But I think that, the use of the line, which I'm just not as familiar with as you are, is extremely interesting in relation to the whole argument about spatialization. And that's what I would look at, I think, is the linearity and how linearity functions in relation to time.
Gracias.
Yo quería comentarle que realmente ha dado en la clave, o creo que ha dado en la clave, al decir que ambos, pues tanto el tráiler como este tipo de cine, pertenecen a sistemas semejantes de denunciación mediática, o podríamos decir a regímenes cronológicos, al mismo régimen cronológico. Y que la velocidad de uno y la experiencia del otro solo es asumible por comparación. porque habitualmente pensamos que uno es más real que el otro. Y creo, si no lo he entendido mal, que ya he comentado que al final ambos son productos de un mismo discurso temporal o emplazamientos diferentes de un mismo, por decirlo en palabras de Foucault, de un mismo archivo cronológico o archivo de experiencia cronológica, archivo de experiencia del tiempo. Entonces, dos emplazamientos de un mismo sistema de experiencia del tiempo, que sería ese tiempo cinemático del que ella habla en su libro. Mi pregunta sería, dado que esos dos archivos esos dos regímenes son completamente artificiales, aunque alguno de ellos nos resulte más cercano al tiempo real, si realmente, no solo en cuanto a la técnica, en la técnica fílmica, que ya habla de la grabación, sino incluso en otro tipo de arte, como la pintura, por ejemplo, si realmente ese tipo de arte, digamos, de la pintura, que podría ser más cercano o más empático, no es también una construcción que pertenece a un tiempo cronológico particular. O, en resumen, si al final toda posición o experiencia del tiempo no es sino perteneciente a un sistema cronológico particular y no hay tiempo real, sino tiempo discursivo en todo momento.
Lost in translation.
Esto es para que no me
I was going to say, I'm living up to that question. In as much as I can gather, which I think he did, he was saying that he was quite interested in the way. Well, he thought that you completely hammered this description of both trailers and the kind of films he was showing as belonging to similar chronological regimes. I mean, in a way, he seemed to understand that your argument was that they're both products of the same archive of temporal experience, only they constitute two different sides of it. So he was saying, well, so taking that into consideration, so both of them are artificial, despite how one of them appears to be kind of closer to lived time, as it were. Maybe something like painting would in itself just be a construction of a different sort of chronological regime, as it were. So could we get to the point of saying that there is no real time, that all time is just discursive?
Yes. I would really say that that's the case. I'm not a Bergsonian ultimately, although I find his work intriguing. I don't think there is a real time out there, and we just need to work to, make our experience of it more authentic, or to retrieve it from some grave. I tend to think, just as Henri Lefebvre does in the production of social space, that space is constructed, that space changes in different chronological regimes, as you put it. And I think the same is very much true of time as well. And of course, the classic argument has to do with the one that Lefebvre makes that I cited about time in a pre-capitalist era being measured in a completely different kind of way, and time then being embedded in social space, measured by the height of the sun, or the relation of the sun to the horizon, the change of the seasons, all of these things that are kind of embedded in a relationship which may seem natural, but is actually understood within a social context. And as soon as you have not only clocks, but I think, pocket watches and wristwatches where you can wear time, and you are constantly assaulted with the idea of what time it is, and minutes take on a different value, that it's pretty clear that our experience of time is socially produced, and that it has been affected to a great extent by the structuring or systematization of work work, leisure, you know, what seems to constitute a divide between them, but often is not one. And the disappearance of leisure time, you know, the whole discourse, the sort of contemporary discourse in journalism today about the continuing diminishment of non-work time, because you can work anywhere. You can take your computer anywhere, you can take your cell phone anywhere. So work exceeds the confines, you know, of a particular place. And, you know, it seems to infiltrate all of life. And that's very much linked to the question of temporality and what it is as well. It's interesting that, you know, Bergson doesn't, for Bergson, and one of the reasons he's so interesting to me, for him there isn't really a time out there. Time is inherently subjective. And it only, you know, has any meaning in that sense. But that's true of matter as well, which has an impact on subjectivity and consciousness that we just don't acknowledge. So one could maybe take him one step further and say, if that's the case, and if Jonathan Crary, for instance, is right about vision and the observer, you know, what has happened to the process of vision and spectating and observing, then it seems to me it would be impossible to activate some of Bergson's insights in relation to an ideological analysis of what constitutes time and what constitutes space.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Espera para grabarlo todo.
No, simplemente preguntar por un libro que han citado al principio, como que estaba pues traducido o que tenía ella algún libro, ¿no? Pues no se me ha quedado el título ni.
Vale. A ver, en castellano hay el último capítulo de este libro, que hace un poco de conclusión, está en una especie de antología que hemos producido con el título Heterocronías, que un poco reúne los temas de los que se habla en este ciclo y, vamos, se vende en el Cendeac. Pero, de cualquier modo, para el 2009 posiblemente, si no a finales de este año, se traducirá el libro completo de nada. Just whether the book was available right around when we did in class. Vale, pues muchas gracias. Mañana hay otra charla del ciclo Heterocronías con Bleda y Rosa, que es un dúo, una pareja de artistas que colaboran, que participan en el PAC y que hablarán de su obra y de la heterocronía aquí mañana. Vale, gracias.